normal Thursday morning. Inside a home just like this one, a 1-year-old boy was starting his day at a daycare, but in just a few moments, a common playground toy would become a deadly trap. This is the story of how a regular day turned into a nightmare and the desperate fight to save a child's life. For the parents of a 1-year-old boy in Washington County, Missouri, January 9th, 2026 started like any other weekday. It was a morning of familiar routines, getting their son ready, and drop him off at his in-home daycare, a house they knew just outside the small city of Potosi. This wasn't some large corporate facility. It was a local woman's home where she cared for a small group of children in a fairly small, tight-knit community where families are often well known and well liked. This kind of setup is common. It can feel more personal, more like leaving your child with a neighbor. For many parents, especially in rural areas where licensed child care options are hard to come by, these small in-home daycares are often the only choice. On that Thursday, there were only 4 or 5 children there, including the provider's own child. It was a quiet, typical morning, full of the sounds of kids playing, but an unimaginable tragedy was about to unfold. Inside the house was a toy slide, the plastic kind many of us have seen in our homes or backyards. It was a simple structure, reportedly red and orange, with just 2 or 3 steps leading to a small platform and a short slide down to the floor. For a toddler, it's an adventure, but this particular slide had a fatal flaw hiding in plain sight. Washington County Sheriff Scott Reed later described the toy in detail. On one side of the slide there were railings, he explained. At the bottom of the railings was an opening about 5 inches tall. That 5-inch gap running along the bottom of the rail is what turned this toy into a death trap. In a horrifying and sudden turn of events, the little boy somehow slipped through that opening. A space of about 5 inches was just big enough for his small body to pass through, but not for his head. As his body went through the gap, his head became lodged. He was trapped. With his head stuck and his body hanging below, his airway was constricted, cutting off oxygen. In an instant, a moment of play had turned into a silent, desperate struggle for life. The call came into dispatch as a child not breathing. Inside the home, the daycare provider had found the horrific scene and was trying to perform life-saving measures. Soon, 2 deputies from the Washington County Sheriff's Office were the first to arrive. They immediately took over, starting CPR in a frantic effort to get the boy breathing again. The emotional toll of that moment is hard to put into words. Sheriff Reed shared just how deeply it affected his deputies. Both of my deputies are young deputies who have young children, he said. One of them has a newborn at home, and it hit him especially hard having to do CPR on a child. He went straight home when he was done and hugged his baby. Fire and ambulance crews arrived and took over with advanced medical care, but it was too late. The little boy could not be revived. He was pronounced deceased, the victim of a piece of equipment that was supposed to bring joy. Sheriff Reed summed up the scene with one devastating word. Horrible. I can't imagine anything more terrible, he said. As the terrible news spread through the Potosi community, a full-scale investigation was launched. Detectives from the Sheriff's Office, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and the Missouri Division of Family Services all arrived at the home, trying to piece together exactly what happened. One of the first questions investigators had to answer was about the daycare's legal status. This wasn't a commercial business, but as Sheriff Reed put it, simply a lady who watches kids in her home. This distinction turned out to be critical. Investigators quickly found that the in-home daycare was unlicensed. However, they also discovered that under Missouri law, it was operating legally. This opened up a much larger and more troubling conversation about child safety and government oversight. The daycare where the toddler died is known as license exempt. According to the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, anyone caring for 6 or fewer children with no more than 3 of them under the age of 2 isn't required to have a license or even report that they're providing care. With only 4 to 5 children present that day, the provider was following the letter of the law. But this legal status comes with serious downside. An almost complete lack of oversight, licensed child care centers in Missouri have to meet strict requirements. They need to pass fire and sanitation inspections, and state regulators check on them twice a year, looking at everything from building safety to toys in the play area. Licensed exempt facilities, on the other hand, operate in a regulatory gray area. While they are supposed to meet some basic health and safety rules, they aren't subject to the same routine inspections. This creates a huge gap where potential dangers like a hazardous toy can go completely unnoticed. The system relies on provides to police themselves a model that tragically failed in this case. The investigation kept coming back to the slide, the 5-inch opening with a textbook entrapment hazard. According to the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commissions, any opening on a playground equipment that's between 3.5 and 9 inches wide is a major risk for head entrapment. These are spaces where a child's body can fit, but their head can't, which can lead to strangulation. Safety standards for playgrounds are designed specifically to eliminate these kinds of gaps. Even though the daycare was license exempt, Missouri's own regulations for these providers say they must frequently inspect their environment for hazards in the play area or with toys and play equipment. The slide's design was a clear and predictable danger that a proper safety check should have caught. When a reporter asked Sheriff Reed if the tragedy could have been prevented, he was careful, seemingly to recognize a legal storm that was sure to come. "I'm sure there is," he said, before adding, "I'm not going to speculate on any of that because, as we all know, the world we live in today, there's going to be a legal action from every direction." His comment hung in the air, an unspoken admission of a failure that went far beyond one home on one tragic morning. The preliminary autopsy report ruled the boy's death as accidental, a finding that did little to ease the grief of his family or the community. In a small town like Potosi, a loss like this isn't just a headline, it's personal. Sheriff Reed mentioned the family was well known, well liked, and that the tragedy affects everybody. The Washington County Sheriff's Office offered the deepest condolences to the family and everyone affected the heartbreaking loss. The incident cast a long shadow, raising new worries about the safety of children in thousands of informal, unlicensed daycares across the state and the country. Experts point out that in many rural counties, a shortage of licensed providers, sometimes called daycare deserts, forces families to use these exempt options, often without knowing the difference in safety standards and oversight. A young boy's life was lost, not because of malice, but because of a hidden danger in a place that should have been safe. A 5-inch gap, a flawed toy design, and a hole in the government regulations created a perfect storm with the most devastating outcome imaginable. This tragedy is a brutal reminder of the immense responsibility that comes with caring for children. It highlights the absolute need for every caregiver, licensed or not, to be trained to spot potential hazards, from unsafe sleep habits to the deadly design of a simple toy. For parents, it's a painful reminder to ask tough questions and to physically inspect any place where they leave their child. The death of this little boy in Potosi is the story of one single catastrophic moment, but it's also a story about the systems we trust to protect our most vulnerable, and what happens when these systems have cracks. It leaves all of us with a haunting question. How many other well-meaning homes, legally operating just out of sight of regulators, have their own 5-inch gap just waiting for a tragedy to happen?